writing a DBQ today, so he came in, and we have another teacher covering his class, so a lot of people are kind of going out of their way to help us today. So obviously, y'all are good kids. You ask a lot of questions, which I think is going to be fine with you, as long as you're getting something out of it. Now is the time. It's the best chance you're going to get for someone to know what they're doing. And I'll be in the back learning as much as you are. That's my plan.
So if you have a question, just ask. It doesn't matter when, it doesn't matter what it is. I'll give it a shot because it's just more fun that way. Well, DBQ typically is the thing that makes people cry. Mr. Justice just saw my third period and they were whining. They're like, oh no, my hand hurts. Because you have 55 minutes to basically write what amounts to a 4-page paper. And you have to take time to look over the documents, and you have to take time to analyze the documents, and to figure out what's going on with all the documents before you actually start writing it. It's fun. And by that I mean it's not. Your pencil's going to be moving so fast you will actually start fire to the paper. If you're doing it right. I'm serious. Let's see, let's get that thing out of the way. Let's actually start talking about some of the things. When it comes to DBQs, or basically any essay question you'll have in that AP US History class that you'll take, maybe some of you 2 years from now, and you'll see me then, there are only 4 flavors of questions. We have causation, you know, like cause and effect, what made something happen. You have continuity and change, which is kind of interesting. It's stuff that you've pretty much done your entire life, but now it's basically taken to a whole new level. I mean, we're talking about how much is something similar to how it was before, continuity, and then how much did it change. We have comparison, you know, similarities and differences. Now, when it comes to comparison, comparison's kind of weird because some of you in high school only like to do half comparisons. Like if we're going to go with something, who do we have? 2 victims. If we were going to compare you to her. And then if we said, oh, she's a girl. That doesn't tell me anything about him. For some reason, high school kids think by comparison you can only do half of it, and you're still assuming the other part. And it's no, it doesn't work that way. Not at all. The 4th flavor you got there is periodization. A lot of times, periodization, you'll actually physically see these words in the fun little question. Where's my writing utensils? There we go. That looks like good flavor. Periodization, you'll actually see the word turning point. Because we are talking about some event that changed America. Whether we're talking about the presidency of Washington, or the presidency of Jackson, or the Mexican-American War, or pick something, some sort of turning point. The good point is, I feel like you have a class all on turning points coming up next year. I think so. It's possible. You never know. But every single DBQ uses one of those 4 historical thinking skills. So you just need to be able to identify which one's which. And it makes your life so much easier. Now let's look at the fun little thing. Here's how you actually write the DBQ.
Can I have Casey to the front office for checkout? She's checking out, Mama.
Sure can.
Thank you.
We're filming it, Case. Don't worry.
So thesis. When you're writing your thesis, and the thesis is the most important part of the paper. Without the thesis, you can't carry it through the rest of the paper, and then all of a sudden you're missing 2 of the 7 points, because every DBQ is based on 7 points. You've seen the rubric, we have it right in front of you there. So when we're talking about the thesis, there are multiple things you have to do. You must use the actual historical thinking skill. Historical thinking, there we go, T and then S. Historical thinking skill that's based in the question. That's the causation, or the periodization, or continuity and change. Those are your historical thinking skills. Then you have to do other things. You're going to need to create these things called categories. Every single essay will have some sort of categories. Sometimes the Evil College Board, trust me, those old people who write all this stuff, are designing the test to basically destroy your lives. That's what they're there for. These really old, evil men are horrible, horrible bad people. And they want you to suffer. So sometimes they give you the categories, and sometimes they don't. We're going with base normal categories. Political, economic, and social tend to be the 3 most common categories. Because there are 3 main changes that could happen: political, economic, or social. Now sometimes, like my kids right now are realizing, it doesn't work. The 7 documents they have right now are all social documents. So they can't write a paragraph on political or economic, and if they try to, it's not going to be good for them. So they have to come up with different social categories, like religion, or women's rights, or whatever else. But then the biggest part, the part that people don't really remember, but you really have to, because so far all we're really doing is just restating the question. The big difference here is you need to set up the argument. You need to set up the argument. Now, how do you set up the argument? The easiest way to do it is by creating examples of your categories. You set it up by having examples. Oh yes, sorry. My handwriting won't get any better within 2 years either. You'll just learn to read it or ask what it actually means. It hasn't gotten better in 16 years now. I don't expect it to get any better. If anything, it'll get worse. But still. So examples of your categories. So if we're talking political, economic, and social, for something like a change in the lives of women in the 1920s, well, what are some political examples? What are some social examples? What are some economic examples? And by putting those things into your thesis, all of a sudden you have all the points that you need. You get the thesis point. Now here's the part that makes English teachers cringe. They don't grade grammar. They don't grade the grammar on this test at all. So it doesn't matter if your thesis is 2 or 3 sentences or one ridiculously long sort of run-on sentence that makes people want to cry. It doesn't matter. The way they designed the rubric 2 years ago, there is no way to distinguish between someone who meets the minimum requirements for every single one of the points or someone who writes this amazing essay. So don't try to write the amazing essay. You don't have time. You have just enough time, barely, to set up and get through the minimum stuff, because the writing is the biggest part of the test. It's more than half of the test. It is the biggest determination between whether you pass or you fail. Everybody's going to get about the same nationally on the multiple choice. The writing determines who gets college credit and who does not. So learn how to do the writing. And you have to stop thinking of historical writing as English writing. They're not the same. Your AP English teachers in 11th and 12th grade will hate the way that you learn to write in social studies, because they're different courses. You're not going to go into a science class and try to do 1 + 1 = 2. That's math. They have different ways to do it, so do we. Just because it's writing doesn't mean it's the same. In fact, our writing here is more of a formula than most other things. Our writing in social studies is much closer to a math problem than it is an English essay. And if you think of it that way, it makes things so much easier. Contextualization is the second part. By contextualization, we're talking about the other things that happened in history during that time period. Every single DBQ gives you years, somewhere between 20 years and 40 or 50 years. You need to know, and I will repeat this many, many times to you, and then probably repeat it, and then repeat it, and repeat it, and repeat it. You need to know when things happened in history. It's great if you know George Washington was our first president, but if you don't know when he actually did things, what's the point of learning he was the first president? You need to know when they happened. You need to know when the War of 1812 ended. You need to know the beginning and the end of the Civil War. You need to know when things happened in history. Because if you don't, you can't answer these questions. The documents are not there to use them as your essay. The documents are there to support the argument in your essay. So contextualization is what else is going on in those years. Because see, there's the thing, and I know I do this as a failure in history and everything. When we talk about things like the American Revolution or World War I or World War II, that's all we talk about. That's not the only thing going on in the entire world or country. You need to know what the other things are. That's contextualization. So that way, if we're talking about the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, you need to know that, oh, well, yeah, during that time, we're going to have the Second Great Awakening. We're going to have reform movements for both women's rights, and we're going to have reform movements for education, and reform movements for the church, and all these other things going on at the exact same time. That's why you have to know when they happened. Contextualization could also be the lead-in. What brought, or what big change or broader theme happened in these 20 years right up to it. Contextualization is within the time that they give you in the question. Then you go to the body paragraphs. Now the body paragraphs, there's no set limit. If you have 3 categories, like political, economic, and social, there should probably be 3 body paragraphs. One with all the political documents, one with all the social, and one with all the economic. You absolutely 100% do not put every document into a separate paragraph. No. Additionally, you do not use the documents in order. The judges, the old people that hate you on College Board, are taught that if you use document 1 and then document 2 and document 3, you get a 0. Because they never put the documents 1, 2, and 3 in the same category on purpose. Because any student who does it that way, they don't know what the heck they're doing, and they fail. It's purposely used. You take the 7 documents and you break them into categories. then you group those categories together. So maybe for political, it's documents 1, 4, and 6. You put them all in the same paragraph. If 2, 3, and 5 are social, you put them in the same paragraph. It's not hard. Some of you are looking at me like deer in the headlights. Don't worry. It won't get better in the next 2 years. Actually, it should. Yeah, Mr. Justice. But still, those are the body paragraphs. You incorporate the documents into your argument. Remember, it's not just the documents. You're also going to need to put in some outside proof because you've seen the second point, the point to the right on the rubric in Part C. And then last, you have synthesis. Basically your last paragraph. Synthesis is something that basically you're taking the same argument but to a different geographical region or a different country or even to an entirely different time period. Like if they're asking you about African Americans right after the Civil War in the 1860s and 70s, well, you can compare it to the lives of African Americans in the 1920s, or the African Americans in the 1960s, or the African Americans during colonial times. Take your pick. As long as you're applying the same argument to a different time period, that's synthesis. And then at the end, you should, as a good writer, restate your thesis, but you don't get a point for restating your thesis, so if you run out of time, skip that part. It works. So now how do you do all this fun stuff? Because the documents, of course, are going to be a big part of your paper. That's the thing that kind of gets you the most. Well, when we're talking about your documents, there are 3 things that you need to do for every single document. Look, my handwriting doesn't get better, sorry. The first thing that you need to do is you need to analyze the document. Now, how the heck do you analyze a document? Well, that's easy. Look at the questions. How or why? So you look at the document and you determine how or why that answers the question. Well, heck, let's go to an actual question. Let's make it more fun. Let's hope it's the bottom one here. Hopefully that looks kind of familiar. Now, sure, up at the top, state a thesis, and these directions are always here. State a thesis, support it. Incorporate all or all but one of the documents. You know what this thing's called? Your rubric. So if you don't have it with you, you do all these things right in order. And guess what? It's everything that you need. But either way, let's look at this fun little question. Evaluate the extent of continuity and change in the lives of African Americans in the South during the period of 1865 to 1905. So it gives you the time period. We want to talk about those years. You start talking about the Civil War, sorry, not in those years. You don't get points for it. You start talking about lives in the Roaring '20s, not after. I mean, that's after 1905. Ain't gonna work. So let's see. Let's say we already learned, and some of you seem to write down, that there were 4 different historical thinking skills. Anyone want to take a rough guess which one's in that question? Oh, don't make Mr. Justice just randomly call on people. Anyone, someone. I see thinking.
Go ahead,
I see
Bailey.
smoke coming out of the ears. Yeah, guys, it's right in the question. Change and continuity. 9 times out of 10, the historical thinking skill is in the question. Continuity and change. If you couldn't figure that out, I'm hoping you're asleep right now, because otherwise, you don't want to be in an AP class. That ain't hard. If it's a periodization question, you'll see the word turning point, just like some of you wrote down. If it's comparison, some of you will see similarities and differences within the question. There are specific cues in there, so you know what it is. If they use the words continuity and change, guess what? That's the skill you've got to discuss. Now notice that one doesn't give you any other specific categories. Why? Because continuity and change are your categories. Oh yeah, by the way, if they don't use the words continuity or change, turning point, or similarities and differences, it's going to be a causation question. So somewhere in there you'll need to use the word cause. You must use the actual historical thinking skill in your thesis. You cannot use synonyms, you cannot use other words, because then they don't know that you know it's the historical thinking skill. They're looking for the words continuity and change, meaning you better use the words continuity and change in your thesis, or you're not getting the point for it. Now then there's the word that really, really confuses high school kids. Extent. What does extent mean? This is the part where you all chime in. Really, speak up, I don't care. Yes, please, thank you.
Isn't it like an add-on?
It's like an adverb, like how much?
More?
Hmm?
Like more?
Yeah, that can work. More can work, or a great amount. I mean, we're talking continuity and change. So a great amount of change, a little amount of change, a minimal amount of change. Pick an adverb, but without adding those adverbs, and one for continuity and one for change, you don't get the thesis point. You must have the extent in there. How much? That's the big thing about historical writing. You are basically not just coming up with an essay, you're writing something and then you have to defend it. That's what all of this is. You pick how much continuity and how much change, and then in the rest of your paper, you have to defend it. That's how it works with all of these things. So how much change and how much continuity? And also, one big mistake my kids still make, you can't have great continuity and great change. Things cannot be totally different, while at the same time, staying exactly the same. It doesn't work that way. They are opposite words for a reason. So you might have great change and minimal continuity, or tons of continuity, but just a wee bit of change. Take your pick. Just by throwing in those two adverbs makes the difference of whether you're going to pass or fail. And then we have our question. Continuity and change in the lives of African Americans. Now, what do you do for your thesis? You reword it. Basically the same thing. There was a, let's say, great amount of change and a little amount of continuity in the lives of African Americans in the South between 1865 and 1905. Some examples of change are, list a few of the examples that have changed. Well, guess what? They're now free of slavery. They're going through the Reconstruction. Those are the examples. You need to put 2 to 3 different examples of each category. And same thing with continuity. What are some examples of continuity? Not that you could ever imagine in our country. Racism. There's race. Yes, there's race. I said the word and some of you are like, whoa, use the word R word. Racism. It happens in our country. Realistically, when you hit AP US history, racism is the answer for about half the questions. You just need to know what type of racism. So you have all of that fun stuff. You know your categories are continuity and change. Well, let's see. Let's say we had this first fun little document. Now, let me have give you a couple other little tips that you definitely need to know, because I already gave you, don't use them in order. Next, you cannot refer to them as document 1 or document 2. You have to refer to them by their title. So this would be the Thaddeus Stevens speech. The other thing you need to know is that source line tells you about 90% of what you need to know. Realistically, sometimes you don't even need to read the documents. If you know enough about history, you can answer it without the documents. If you know enough about Thaddeus Stevens, if you know that Thaddeus Stevens is from the North, if you know that all throughout this thing, Thaddeus Stevens pushed for the passage of the 14th Amendment, if you know that Thaddeus Stevens was a leader of the radical Republicans that really wanted the South to be